Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are for the witnesses from the Canadian Airports Council and the Regional Community Airports of Canada. For the past 8 months, the government has been talking at a high level about its plan to save Canada's airports from bankruptcy. Then on Monday, Minister Freeland delivered her fall economic statement, which included a section about support for the air sector. And this section describes funding for health and safety infrastructure and for transit infrastructure, as well as waiving or deferring lease payments for the next few years. Do you feel that the government's plan to save Canada's airports from bankruptcy meets your needs? And if not, why not?
We have
I
Miss.
can.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take that. The $500 million that you describe certainly will be very helpful. We recommended that. In fact, we recommended most of what was in there. It just was not at level sufficient for our nation's airports to avoid real serious challenges next year. That money will be very valuable. Certainly, there's a big project in Montreal, but the price tag for that project is $600 million. We have $225 million in additional runway investments that need to be made to add runway and safety areas. It's a federal regulation that's coming into place. We've got airports that are making investments into accessibility upgrades because of regulations that are coming into place. Our members do not oppose these regulations, but they do wonder how they're going to be able to pay for them. In terms of the rent relief, we've been saying for quite some time, it really does need to be an actual waiver of rent, and it needs to be for multiple years if it's to have a meaningful impact. And even with that, for the 14 smallest airports, including Regina and your community, rent relief when a waiver on rent when rent is a revenue charge and you're not bringing in but a fraction of what you were making is not as valuable as it would be in year 2, year 3, year 4 when traffic is actually starting to recover and those volumes and those revenues that come with it are starting to recover. As a result, airports are taking on debt, $2.8 billion in debt that needs to be repaid. The situation is kind of bizarre. If the government was to give an airport $10 million, that's $10 million in revenue they do not need to raise in another way. If the airport doesn't get that and they have to borrow that money, when they have to pay interest on that back. So actually, the federal government makes more money when the airport doesn't have relief and has to borrow, because for every dollar that the airport has to generate to pay back in revenue in debt, it's also paying back in interest, and the federal government gets a cut on every one of those dollars. So the situation is very difficult. It's not sustainable, certainly without additional support for airports.
Mr. Kram.
Okay, thank you. And last week, I guess I should follow up on a question my colleague, Mr. Bacharach, asked. Last week, various news outlets reported that NAV Canada was planning to shut down the air traffic control towers at the airports in, I believe it was Whitehorse, Prince George, Fort McMurray, Regina, Sault Ste. Marie, Windsor, and Saint Jean, Quebec. Could the witnesses representing the airports give us an idea of what it means for the airport's capacity to attract new flights and new carriers when the airport does not have an air traffic control tower? And can the other witnesses representing the airlines give us an idea of what it means to the airlines who want to increase services to an airport when that airport does not have an air traffic control tower?
Gentlemen.
Brian, do you want to take that one first?
I think from the perspective of our members in regional and community airports, air traffic control towers certainly have not been the catalyst as to whether or not we receive service. Those areas at this time are just simply trying to get by and ensure that they can keep the fees to keep those airlines flying in. I think that's a better question for the carriers, especially to identify how they do work with those situations.
1 minute.
And I'm sorry, Chair, do I have the floor again?
You do? You have 1 minute, Mr. Kram.
Okay, well, then I would like to hear an answer from my previous question from the witnesses representing the airlines about, as we come out of the pandemic, if an airport does not have an air traffic control tower, how does that impact the airline's ability to increase flights to the airport?
I'll just go quickly and then to my colleague John. Our principle concern about anything with respect to ATC, air traffic control and navigation, is with respect to safety and safety of operations. You do absolutely look at the coverage you're going to get and the times of days that you'll get coverage and whether your alternates will actually be covered in order to fly service. So it can have a commercial implication, but ultimately you're most focused on safety and the provision of safety services. And I think that does come back to my earlier comments about NAV Canada needing support.
Thank you, Mr. McNanny. Thank you, Mr. Kram.